I'm going to refer to the cables we're knitting today as V cables. Worldwide and throughout history, they have a number of different names, and there are quite a lot of similar cables, but this will make things simpler. Some of the things I've run into is it's an upside-down tree cable also, and it is very similar to a design called wheat ear, although that frequently involves single stitches rather than pairs of stitches being moved out, and usually has a knit stitch up its center, so it really does resemble a wheat ear. But it's made in very much the same way. Here are the variations we're going to try. This is the simplest version. One V ends, another V starts, and we move on from V to V. In this one, the V's are nested. It's a little bit of a tighter fit, so a lot more is happening on those central rows. And in this one, I don't actually show you how to do it, but it's very easy to see. There are 2 cable crosses rather than 1. Both occur sequentially at the beginning of the V. You will see how it's done in a moment. It won't be any difficulty for you to understand. We begin with the ribber and the main bed carriage set so that their stitches will match in size. I'm fortunate mine happen to be the same on the dial. That's not always the case. In fact, it's probably more often not the case. So you'll need to first experiment and find out what will create an even matching fabric for you. And then the setup is like this. 4 stitches on the main bed, pretty much any number that you want of background stitches on the ribber, and a few stitches on the main bed to finish something like a scarf or for the purposes of my demonstration. For this design, something happens every 2 rows. So first we'll knit 2 rows. Now we're going to take these 2 pairs of stitches and cross them. 2 separate 2-prong tools. Lift up a pair on each tool. Cross them. I'm going right over left, meaning that the right stitches are moved to the left needles first, and it will literally be over on the finished fabric because the right side is over here, so the ones you crossed first will be on top of the ones you crossed second. If you need a little help knitting, see how these needles are under some stress? Bring the needles out to knit back from hold, then knit 2 rows. Now that was the only true cable cross in the whole process. Now we move out 1 needle space for this pair, out 1 needle space for this pair. I think of it as legs moving apart. And we take a single prong tool and move the ribber stitches over so they are no longer in the way of the knitter stitches. Whoops. These beds were set up so that the stitches oppose, and if all the needles came out, they would bang into each other. But they won't all come out because we're only using some, so it'll be fine. Again, we knit 2 rows. 1, 2. And again, we move each pair of stitches outwards towards the edge of the work. And the ribber stitch is now in the way. It moves over 2 places to take care of the fact that 2 stitches have been moved on the main bed. And we repeat this as often as we need to. You can vary the size of this cable quite a lot. It is called a cable, but this action is usually called in hand knitting a cross. There are other terms too, rather than a cable, because the knit stitches are not going over one another. It's purls and knits changing places. So when the knit stitches move across the background stitches, which are purls, it's generally called a cross, whereas that first thing we did is called a cable. Knit 2 rows. You can keep this up as long as you want to. Of course, you would have needed to allow more purl stitches, that is river stitches, than I did. But this is going to be my last cross. It's a pretty typical size. Move in. Knit 2 rows. Now it's time to begin at the center again. Unlike a diamond cable, which this has resembled greatly up to now, we never bring these legs back in so they converge. Instead, they end here. They become part of the background, which means they move to the river for the purposes of this video. We go back to the center and find the center 4 stitches, counting in. There they are between my fingers. These 4 move to the knitter, and we begin the whole process again. You will remember it began with 2 rows. And this is one variant that you will see. I'm going to cross at the beginning of every, I'll call it point of the V. But you don't have to. There are variants of this cable where this never occurs. You just start knitting on the 4 and then gradually move them apart. Move apart. Move apart. Move in. Move in. And repeat. We are continuing to move the legs apart and to move the background stitches inward. This is really very straightforward. Now at this point, whoops, better not drop that. I have one more repeat to do of the moving outward of the knit stitches. Knit 2 rows and do it again. But a variant on the pattern that makes the V's more closely nested with each other. That's not very clear to you. Hang on. If my fingers are the yarn, what we did up to now will produce this. One V ends, there are 2 rows, the next V begins. But we can get an effect more like this, which is also very common. And the way we would do that is to begin the next repeat starting with the 2 rows in the center before completing the final diverging of the V legs. So we'll knit 2 rows, we'll move out once again, move these in once again, and I almost forgot to put enough stitches. There have to be 4 in the center to make 2 V legs. So they'll start showing before the V has reached its widest point. Using this option, several things go on this row. As usual, we finish our final outward move of the legs. and our final inward move of the background. But in addition, since these stitches have already been transferred to the main bed, it's their turn to get cabled. You can see these two methods are actually identical in terms of what happens. The difference between them is that this action, having transferred to the main bed and now making a cable cross, occurs while the V is still being formed. Now we're done with this V, and just as before, we transfer back to the main bed. But because we have already begun the process of making the V in the center, two things occur on this row also. We begin moving out. And now it will be the same. Now the process will be the same until we've made the third move outward. This is the second move outward. And the background stitches come inward. Two rows. Third move outward. And inward. And for the nested V's, this is the moment when we transfer across the bed. And as before, we begin one V while we're still finishing the other. So that's the difference. Sometimes you start one V, finish it, start another V, and finish it. Sometimes you start one before finishing the other, and there's more to do some rows.